The rancher aimed his rifle at the trespasser. It was a widow returning his stolen mare. The moon was still up when Opal crossed the creek. She had been riding since well before dark, the stolen mare on a lead rope behind her, and the mare had been difficult for the first 2 hours, sidling and pulling and throwing her head, but had settled somewhere around midnight into a tired, reluctant cooperation. They were both tired. They were both doing something they had not planned on doing. The creek ran shallow in late summer, barely knee-high on the horse she rode, and the mare stepped through it without trouble, hooves finding the gravel bottom with the sure knowledge of a horse that had crossed this water before. That was how Opal had known she was close. Stolen horses remember home. She had not known whose ranch this was when she found the mare 3 days ago, hip-deep in the scrub along the South Canyon wall, tangled in her own lead rope and going thin with thirst. She had known only that the brand on the hip, a simple arrowhead shape, clean and deep, meant someone was missing her. A horse this well-kept did not belong in a canyon. She had watered her and fed her and started asking questions at the first settlement she reached. The answers had taken 2 days. The ranch was called the Arrow Cross. The man who owned it was named Callaway Vane, and he ran the biggest cattle operation in the Aldine River Basin. The horse was his best mare, a gray quarter horse named Silver Creek. She had been taken from the paddock 6 days ago by a man named Dufresne, who owed Callaway Vane a sum of money he had no intention of repaying. What none of the people she had asked told her, because they likely did not think it worth saying, was that Callaway Vane had a habit of patrolling his own fence line before first light. She came up out of the creek bed onto the south grass of the Arrow Cross Ranch, and she heard the hammer click. She stopped her horse. "Hands where I can see them!" The voice came from her left, from the shadow of a stand of cottonwoods 30 yards out, and it was the kind of voice that had not raised itself. It did not need to. It was already at the register that meant this is not a warning. She raised both hands slowly, the lead rope still wrapped around her right palm, the gray mare pulling back slightly at the sound of the stranger and then stilling again. "I am returning your horse," she said. A long silence. The creek moved behind her. A nighthawk called somewhere above. "Ride into the open." She nudged her horse forward, out of the shadow of the cottonwoods on her side of the bank, into the pale moonlit grass. She kept her hands up. She kept her face forward. She heard hoofbeats approaching from the left, measured, not rushing, and then a rider came alongside her and she could see him in the moonlight. He was on a dark horse, a big one, and he carried the rifle across the saddle in a way that was not pointed at her, but was not pointed away either. He looked at the gray mare on the lead rope. He looked at Opal. She could not read his face clearly in the dark. She could read his stillness, which was the particular stillness of a man deciding something. "Where did you find her?" he said. "South Canyon, tangled in her rope, no water, 3 days ago." "And you rode her here?" "I rode my own horse here. She is on the lead." Another silence. He leaned forward and looked at the mare, and the mare turned her head toward him and made a sound low in her chest that was not quite a whinny. Something shifted in the set of his shoulders. "You alone?" he asked. "Yes." "Riding after midnight with a strange horse on a lead, onto private land, alone?" "I was not planning to arrive at midnight," she said. "She slowed down in the afternoon, and I did not want to push her. She was thin when I found her." He looked at her again. She could feel the assessment in it even in the dark. "Ride to the barn," he said, slowly. She rode to the barn slowly. The barn was warm and smelled of good hay and horses, and when the lantern was lit, she saw 3 things at once: the quality of the place, which was evident in the way everything was kept, the horse, who walked into her stall and dropped her head to the water bucket with the deep relief of an animal that has come home, and the man, who was not what she had expected from his voice. He was somewhere in his middle 40s, broad through the chest, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered into planes and angles that would have been called handsome if he had allowed any softness in the expression. He was not allowing any softness in the expression. He stood in the center of the barn aisle with the rifle at his side now, looking at her the way she imagined he looked at a contract before he signed it. She had put her hands down when they reached the barn. She did not put them back up. She was too tired for theater. "Opal Dennard," she said. "I am a widow out of Cartwright County. I was riding north looking for work when I found your mare. I am not a thief and I am not a trespasser. I am a woman who spent 3 days and 2 nights on the road returning your property, and right now I would be grateful for water if you have it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and took a tin cup from the hook by the barn door and went to the water barrel and filled it and held it out. She drank. She had been offered water before, had drunk from tin cups on 100 different porches in her travels across the Western Territories. But something about the plainness of this gesture, no words attached, no conditions, no calculation, landed somewhere behind her sternum, and she had to hold herself very still to keep it from showing. "Callaway Vein," he said when she handed back the cup. "I know," she said. "I asked about the brand." "What else did they tell you?" "That you are the largest ranch in this basin, that the horse was taken by a man named Dufresne, that you have been looking for her." A pause. "That you do not take kindly to people on your land without invitation." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "They were right about all of it," he said. "I gathered." He looked at the gray mare, who was eating now, steadily and with purpose. He watched her for a long moment, and she could see something in his face that had nothing to do with property or value. That horse meant something to him that she was not yet equipped to understand. "The bunkhouse has a spare room," he said finally. "It is late. You can sleep and ride on in the morning." "I do not want charity," she said. "It is not charity," he said. "It is a bed in exchange for not shooting you when I had reasonable grounds to." She looked at him. He looked at her. "All right," she said. The spare room in the bunkhouse annex had a cot and a window and a washstand and nothing else, and she sat on the edge of the cot after he had gone and put her face in her hands and let herself shake for exactly 1 minute. She had been holding steady since midnight, and the ride and the rifle and the moonlit assessment of a man with every reason to be hostile, and she was entitled to 1 minute. Then she washed her hands and face in the cold basin water and lay down on the cot in her clothes and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she was doing. She was 36 years old. She had been a widow for 18 months. Her husband, Birch, had been a good man and a poor farmer, and the land had eventually broken him the way it broke a lot of men who came west with ambition and not quite enough luck. She had sold what could be sold, settled what could be settled, and started north because a woman she had written to in the town of Aldine had written back saying there might be work. There was always might. There was never certainly. She had $40 and a sore back and a horse that needed rest as much as she did, and she had just spent 3 days out of her way returning a horse to a man who had aimed a rifle at her for her trouble. She told herself that was amusing. She did not entirely convince herself. She slept. In the morning, she woke to the sound of boots on the bunkhouse porch, and for a moment, she did not know where she was. Then she remembered. She got up and smoothed her dress and her hair as best she could and opened the door. One of the ranch hands, a young man with a gap between his front teeth and a look of practiced neutrality, was setting a covered plate on the porch railing. He nodded at her and walked away without speaking. She uncovered the plate. eggs and cornbread and a cup of coffee still hot enough to steam in the morning air. She stood on the porch and ate, looking out at the ranch yard coming alive in the early light. Men moving between barn and corral, a dog lying in the dust by the water trough. The big house across the yard. 2 stories of weathered timber with a covered porch that ran the full front face. Calloway Vane came out of the barn at the far end of the yard. He did not look toward the bunkhouse. He crossed the yard to the round pen and vaulted the fence and began working a young horse she had not seen before, moving it with the particular patience and precision of a man who had been doing this his entire life. She watched him for longer than she should have. She took her plate back inside and washed it in the basin and told herself to collect her horse and ride north to Aldine and not think twice about it. She was going to have to walk past the round pen to get to where her horse was stabled. She walked past the round pen. She had not intended to stop. But the young horse was doing something that interested her, a peculiar hitch in its left shoulder stride that was not lameness, but was not right either, and she stalked without meaning to and looked, and that was when he noticed her. He did not say anything, but he slowed the horse and turned it and watched her watching the horse. "His left shoulder," she said, before she could think better of it. "He is guarding something. It is not in the leg, probably a small muscle pull somewhere in the chest or shoulder. It will get worse if you work him through it." Calloway Vane stopped the horse entirely. He looked at her over the fence rail. The morning light was flat and clear, and she could see his face properly for the first time, the lines around his eyes, the set of a jaw that did not move unless he was making a decision, the particular quality of his attention, which was complete. "How do you know that?" he said. "My father raised horses in Tennessee. I spent more time in his barn than in the house." She paused. "I can show you where to feel for it if you want. It is just under the chest muscle, like a knot in a rope." A pause. Then he unlatched the gate without a word. She went in. She found it in 3 minutes, a tight band of muscle just behind the left shoulder, hot to the touch, the horse flinching when she pressed. She worked her fingers into it carefully, the way her father had taught her, and the horse blew out a long breath through its nose and shifted its weight. Calloway Vane stood at the horse's head and watched her hands. "Arnica and rest," she said. 3 days, maybe 4, then start him slow." "I know about arnica," he said, but he said it without sharpness. "I know you do," she said. "I was telling the horse." This time, the thing at the corner of his mouth became something real, brief and quickly suppressed, but she had seen it, and it landed somewhere unexpected. She stepped back. She was too aware of how close they were standing in the small pen, of the warm animal smell of the horse and the hay and leather smell of him, of his eyes on her in that complete, unblinking way. "I should get my horse," she said. "Where are you headed?" "Aldine. There might be a position there." "Might," he said. "Might," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the young horse. Then, "I need a cook. Mine left 3 weeks ago. My foreman's wife has been covering it, and she is going to stop speaking to her husband if it goes on much longer." Opal looked at him. "I am not a cook," she said. "You just diagnosed my horse and showed more sense than most of my hands. I will take the risk." "Mr. Vane, Calloway." She stopped. "My housekeeper manages the domestic accounts," he said, "but she is 63 and her eyes are going and she cannot manage the kitchen anymore on top of it. Someone needs to cook 3 meals a day for 6 men and manage a larder. If you can do that until I find someone permanent, you will have room and board and fair wages." She looked at the young horse, who was standing quietly now, the tight shoulder eased. She thought about Aldine and the might. 3 weeks, she said, until you find someone." He nodded. She would stay longer than 3 weeks. They both knew it, though neither said so. The Arrow Cross ran 6 hands in the summer and 4 in the winter, and Callaway Vane ran them with the quiet authority of a man whose word had not been challenged in long enough that the habit of challenging it had died out. The men were not unkind to Opal. They were wary, the way men are wary of a change to an established order. But they ate what she cooked and left the plates on the porch step and did not complain, which was its own kind of approval. She learned the ranch the way she learned everything, by watching and by working. The larder had been badly managed, and she organized it without being asked. The kitchen garden was half dead from inattention, and she revived what could be revived and planted what the season would still allow. She found a shelf of account books in the kitchen that had been used to record food costs and had not been updated in months, and she updated them because disorder in records was something she could not leave alone. Callaway Vane noticed. He did not say anything directly, but on the 3rd morning she came in to find a new tin of coffee on the kitchen table that had not been there the night before, and on the 5th morning a sack of flour from the good mill in Aldine that she had mentioned once in passing cost less than the one they had been using. She told herself those were practical decisions. The ranch needed coffee. The flour saved money. She told herself that several times. There was a man in town she needed to be cautious about. She had learned his name on her 2nd visit to Aldine for supplies. Reuben Dufresne, the same man who had stolen Silver Creek. He was still in the territory. She had seen him at the far end of the main street, talking to 2 other men with the posture of someone who had a plan. He had not seen her. She had not told Callaway. She told herself she was waiting until she knew more. That was partly true. The fuller truth was that she did not yet know what Dufresne wanted, and she was not going to bring a half-formed warning to a man like Callaway Vane. She would bring him the whole of it or nothing. She started listening more carefully at the dry goods when she went for supplies. What she heard, piece by piece over the following week, assembled into something she did not like. Dufresne had not stolen Silver Creek for spite or for money. He had stolen her as a provocation, to draw Callaway off the ranch and onto the road looking for her, so that a man named Gill could approach the Arrow Cross's note holder in Aldine about the outstanding debt on the south pasture land. Callaway was land-rich and cash-careful, and Dufresne and Gill had found the one lever that might move him. If the note was called while he was distracted and off his land, he would not have the liquid funds to meet it without selling something. The plan had not worked the way they intended because Silver Creek had not stayed stolen. She had been recovered not by Callaway, but by a widow on a tired horse who had nothing better to do with 3 days than return someone's property. But Dufresne did not know that the plan had failed yet. He thought Callaway was still looking for the mare. She turned this over in her mind all the way back to the ranch. She found Callaway in the barn that evening, checking Silver Creek's feed. She waited until he turned. "I need to tell you something," she said. He straightened. He looked at her face, and something in him went still. "Tell me," he said. She told him all of it, every piece, in the order she had gathered it, without embellishment. She told him what Dufresne had intended and what Gill was doing and what she had deduced about the timing. She told him she was sorry she had not said something sooner, but she had wanted to be sure. He listened without interrupting. His face did not change in the way a less controlled man's face would have changed. There was no flash of anger, no visible alarm. But his hands stilled on the stall gate in a way that told her he was working very hard to keep the rest of himself as controlled. "How long have you known Dufresne's name?" he said when she finished. "Since my 2nd trip to Aldine. That was 6 days ago." "Yes." A pause that had weight in it. "You should have told me." "I know. I wanted to be certain." Opal. Just her name. She felt the two syllables land differently than she had expected, not with anger, but with something that was somehow more disconcerting than anger, something careful and personal. "I understand if you are angry," she said. "I am not angry," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I am trying to understand why you carried this alone for 6 days instead of bringing it to me." She looked at him. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I did not know yet if you were the kind of man who would act on a half-formed warning or the kind who would dismiss it, and I could not afford to guess wrong." He looked at her for a long time. "And now you know," he said. "I think so," she said. Something shifted between them in the warm, hay-scented air of the barn. She could not name it exactly. It was the particular shift that happens when two people who have been circling each other finally land on the same ground. "Ride with me to Aldine tomorrow," he said. "I need to speak to Caldwell at the note holder's office, and I would rather have someone along who already knows the shape of the situation." She nodded. She did not let herself think too long about what it meant that he had asked her. The ride to Aldine took an hour and a half at an easy pace, and they rode most of it without speaking, which she had expected. She had learned enough about Calloway Vane in 2 weeks to know that silence was not his distance. It was his comfort. He was a man who spoke when he had something to say and was not anxious about the space between. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she was not anxious about it either. At one point, she startled a jackrabbit from the grass, and her horse shied sideways, and she brought him back around without drama, and when she looked over, Calloway was watching her with that complete, unblinking attention. "You ride like someone who grew up on horseback," he said. "I did. Tennessee." "Yes, we had 12 horses at the peak. Before the war took most of them." A pause. "Your father fought?" "He did not come back." She kept her voice even. "I was 17. I learned to manage what was left because there was no one else to do it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My brother did not come back either." She looked at him. It was the first personal thing he had volunteered, and she understood the weight of it, that it was offered not as a bid for sympathy, but as a recognition, as though he were saying, "You are not the only one who built something from the wreckage." She did not say she was sorry, because she had learned that people who had truly lost things did not need the words. She just nodded. They rode on. The road to Aldine cut through open grassland for the first mile and then dropped into a shallow valley where cottonwoods grew thick along a seasonal creek. The shade was welcome. The horses settled into it. She was aware that their stirrups were close enough to almost touch on the narrow trail, and she was aware that Calloway rode with a particular kind of physical calm that she had seen in very few people, men or women, and that she associated with people who were comfortable in the space they occupied on the earth. She had spent a good portion of her life uncomfortable in her space. Too much. Always too much. Whether in her parents' house or her husband's or the various places she had passed through since. It was peculiar and disarming to ride beside someone who simply was where he was, without apology and without performance. She thought about that all the way down through the Cottonwood Valley. The meeting with Caldwell at the note holder's office did not go the way Dufresne and Gill had planned, primarily because Calloway Vane arrived in person, with his accounts in order and a very clear understanding of where the leverage was supposed to come from and why it had failed. Caldwell was not a dishonest man, but he was a cautious one, and he had allowed Gill to make inquiries that should not have been entertained. Calloway laid this out in the flat, certain voice that she was beginning to understand was not his angry voice, but his final voice, the one that came after all decisions had been made. Caldwell agreed to honor the existing note terms. He agreed to notify Calloway directly if any further inquiries were made about the Arrowcross's debt. He did not look comfortable, but he looked like a man who understood he had made an error and intended to correct it. Dufresne was a separate matter. Calloway spoke with the county sheriff that afternoon, a straight-backed man named Aldrich who listened with the attention of someone who had been waiting for this conversation. Dufresne was found at the saloon on the south end of Main Street by two of the sheriff's deputies before the sun went down. Opal was not present for any of this. She was at the dry goods, acquiring the flour and the salt and the other items on her list because the ranch still needed feeding and the world continued regardless of its dramas. She was on her way back to where the horses were tied when she came around the corner of the livery and found Gil. He was a narrow-faced man in a coat that was too heavy for the weather, and he had clearly been watching for Calloway and found her instead, which had not been his plan, but which he had decided to make use of. He stepped into her path and said in a low, even voice that she had made a mistake getting involved in things that were not her business, and that a woman on her own, with no connections and no property and no standing in this territory, would be well advised to remember how easy it was to lose what little she had. She looked at him. She had been threatened before. She had been threatened by men who were more frightening than Gil and in circumstances that were considerably more isolated. She had stood in a doorway at 2 a.m. with her husband too sick to rise from bed and a man on the porch she did not know. She had learned what she was made of in those years, and it was not glass. "You have mistaken me for someone who frightens easily," she said. "That is your second mistake today. Your first was thinking Calloway Vane would be manageable." She stepped around him and walked to the horses. Her hands were perfectly steady. She had them both untied and was holding Calloway's reins when he came up the street from the sheriff's office and found her standing there. He looked at her expression, and then he looked behind her at Gil, who was still standing at the corner of the livery. "He threatened you," Calloway said. Quiet, level. "He tried to," she said. He looked at Gil for a long moment. Then he took his horse's reins from her hand, and she felt his fingers close over hers briefly, deliberately, before he took the leather. Not an accident, not a careless gesture. She felt it run from her hand all the way to the place in her chest that had been carefully closed for a year and a half. He went and spoke to Gil. She did not hear what he said. She did not need to. Whatever it was, Jill walked away from it looking smaller and did not look back. Calloway came back to the horses. He did not explain what he had said. She did not ask. They rode home in the afternoon light, the scrub on either side of the road casting long shadows, the air cooling as the sun went down, and she thought about hands and deliberate gestures and the particular way a man says a woman's name when he has started to understand what it means to him. She thought about 3 weeks and how the word permanent had a different quality in her mind than it had had before. The crisis, when it came not from Dufresne or Jill or any external source. It came from inside the ranch and from a direction she had not watched carefully enough. His name was Pryor, and he was the Arrow Cross foreman, and he had worked for Calloway Vane for 9 years. He was a competent man and a loyal one, and his objection to Opal was not personal and was not unkind. It was the objection of someone who had managed a closed system successfully and saw in her the agent of change to that system. He had not tried to drive her off. He had done something quieter and more effective. He had been talking. She found out on a Saturday morning from the foreman's wife, Maura, who was a plain-spoken woman of 50 with no patience for indirect dealing. Maura told her over a cup of coffee at the kitchen table with the directness of someone who considers it a service. Pryor had been telling the other hands that Opal was not what she appeared, that her husband's debts were darker than she had admitted, that there had been a warrant in Cartwright County, a claim against the estate that she had not settled honestly. That a woman who arrived with nothing and attached herself to a wealthy man's household within days of arrival had a purpose that was not innocent. None of it was true. She knew precisely what was true about her Cartwright County history because she had lived every inch of it. The debts had been paid, the estate settled, the records clear. But a rumor did not need to be true. It needed only to be repeated. She sat with this for the rest of the day. She sat with it while she made supper and served it and cleaned up after, and she sat with it in her room afterward with the particular cold clarity she had developed over the last hard years. She thought about what her options were and what each of them cost. She could confront Pryor. She could go to Calloway. She could do nothing and let it run its course and trust that her actual conduct would eventually answer it. Or she could pack her bag and leave. That thought had a weight to it she had not expected, heavier than it should have been for 3 weeks of employment at a ranch she had not planned to visit. Heavier than a cot in a bunkhouse annex, and a kitchen that was not hers, and a man who watched her with complete attention and had once, briefly and deliberately, closed his hand over hers on a set of reins. She told herself that was a reason to leave, not a reason to stay. The less it cost her to go, the better. She sat at the window looking out at the dark yard. A lamp was burning in the main house, in the room she knew was his study. It had been burning late for the past 3 nights. She checked the latch on her door, then she checked it again. He came to the kitchen before the others the next morning, the way he sometimes did, and she put coffee in front of him and was turning back to the stove when he said, "Pryor told me what he has been saying." She stopped. "Pryor told you," she said. "Pryor came to me last night and told me directly. He said he had been speaking out of line and wanted to set it right before it went further." A pause. "He is not a bad man. He is a man who was afraid of something changing and handled the fear badly." She turned. He was looking at the coffee cup, not at her. "I looked into what he said," Calloway continued. "I have a man in Cartwright County I trust. I wrote to him the first week you were here." She stared at him. "You investigated me." "Yes." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a rooster was announcing the morning with its usual lack of timing. "And?" she said. "Your estate was settled honestly. Your husband's debts were paid to the last dollar, including debts that no one would have blamed you for walking away from. The record is clean." He looked up. "I want you to know I know that." She should have been angry. She considered being angry. But the exhaustion of the previous day had taken the edge off the impulse, and underneath the exhaustion was something that was not anger at all. The unwilling recognition that a man who investigated, rather than assumed, was a man trying to be fair, even if he had gone about it without telling her. "You could have asked me," she said. "I know. I should have." She turned back to the stove and was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking of leaving," she said. She heard the coffee cup set down. "I know," he said. "Your bag was moved." She closed her eyes briefly. "Opal?" She heard the chair move. She heard him cross the kitchen. He stopped behind her, and she did not turn, but she was aware of every inch of the air between them. "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to hear it plainly, because I do not know another way to say things." "All right," she said. "I have not asked anything of anyone in 4 years," he said, "since my wife died. I closed everything off and I ran the ranch, and I told myself that was sufficient. Then you rode up out of the dark with my horse on a lead and your hands up, and the most aggravating amount of composure I have ever encountered. And something in me that I had decided was finished turned out not to be finished." She turned around. He was very close. She had not realized how close until she turned. His face in the early morning light was open in a way she had not seen it before. The composed surface still there, but something underneath it showing, the way a light shows through old cloth. "I am asking you not to leave," he said. "Not because the kitchen needs a cook. Because I have not looked for anyone in 4 years, and I am not going to find another one of you." The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the particular clean morning smell of a house waking up. She could hear the hands beginning to stir in the bunkhouse across the yard. "I told you I would stay 3 weeks," she said. "You did." "It has been 3 weeks." "I know." "I suppose I could renegotiate the terms," she said. The thing that happened to his face then was not subtle. It was the arrival of a real smile, slow and full and transforming, the kind that showed you who a person had been before they closed the door on themselves. And she thought she would remember it. The quality of the morning light and the smell of the coffee and the exact weight of what it cost a man like this to ask for something. She reached out and put her hand flat against his chest, and he put his hand over it. And neither of them said anything for a long moment, because the particular language they had developed between them was not primarily made of words, and they both knew it. He pressed her hand once, deliberate and certain. She left her hand there. The things that followed settled into the ranch the way a good season settles in, gradually, then fully, without drama. Pryor apologized to her directly and without prompting, in the spare, flat way of a man who meant it, and she accepted in the same register, and they understood each other afterward without needing to discuss it again. The hands adjusted. Moore continued to be plain-spoken about everything, and they developed an efficient and genuine friendship over kitchen tables and early mornings. Dufresne was dealt with by the county sheriff and did not return to Aldine. Gill left the territory, which was its own kind of answer. Caldwell at the note holder's office was scrupulous from that point forward in his dealings with the Arrow Cross, having understood what it cost to be otherwise. Silver Creek healed and recovered her condition, and by October was as fine a mare as she had ever been. The young horse with the shoulder muscle healed on arnica and 3 days of rest, and went on to become one of the best cutters on the ranch. Calloway told her this one evening in a tone of studied casualness that suggested he was not going to make a large thing of it, but wanted her to know. She made him tell her how the horse had done in his first cattle work, and she watched his face while he talked, and he knew she was watching, and did not stop himself from letting the pride in the telling show. And she thought that was the best thing she had seen in a very long time. In November, he rode to Aldine and came back with a ring. He did not make a speech about it. He put it on the kitchen table one evening while she was writing out the accounts, and she looked at it and then at him, and he said, "I am asking. You know I am asking." "You could actually ask," she said. "Will you marry me, Opal?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He sat down across from her at the table, and they went back to the accounts, and after about 10 minutes, he reached across and took her hand and held it on top of the ledger page, and neither of them mentioned it. She sat there with her hand in his, and the lamp between them, and the autumn dark pressing at the windows, and the account book open to a page that was finally, after months of careful work, in the black. By spring, the ranch had a different quality. It was not the land. The land was as it had always been, vast and indifferent and beautiful in its severity. It was the people on it. A kitchen that ran well and warm, a child's voice in the yard, his nephew's boy, sent out from Missouri for the summer, who was 6 years old and very loud, and had taken an immediate devotion to Silver Creek that seemed likely to outlast the season. Mora's husband, the foreman, who had made his peace and was easier in himself for having done so. And on a morning in late April, Opal stood on the porch of the main house in the early light with a cup of coffee and watched Calloway work Silver Creek in the round pen. The mare moved easy and collected, recovered and whole, her gray coat catching the morning light. He had not seen Opal yet. She watched him the way she had watched him that first morning from the bunkhouse porch, with the awareness of a woman who has stopped lying to herself about what she sees. He felt her watching eventually, the way people do when the attention is consistent enough to have weight. He looked up from the horse. Across the yard, in the flat gold morning light, he looked at her. He did not wave. He did not say anything. He just looked, the way he always had, with that complete and unblinking attention that had never felt like being examined, that had always felt like being seen. She raised her coffee cup slightly. Something shifted in his face, and she knew it was the smile, the real one, the one that showed the whole of him. She turned back to the yard and the morning and the season that was just beginning, and she thought about a night she had crossed a dark creek with a stranger's horse on a lead, and both hands raised and no idea what was waiting on the other side. She thought it was the best accidental decision she had ever made. The ranch spread out around her in the early light, the grass coming green again after the winter, the horses moving in the pastures, the sky enormous and pale and full of the particular spring promise that the frontier always made and sometimes, if you stayed long enough and were stubborn enough and lucky enough, kept. She had nowhere else she needed to be. She was already home. If that story moved something in you, if you have ever done a kindness for a stranger and had it turn your whole life in a direction you did not expect, leave a comment and tell me about it. Hit the like button if Opal earned your heart the way she earned his. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next story finds you. And tell me this. If you had been the one riding across that dark creek with both hands up, would you have kept going, or would you have turned around?